It has been over 3.5 years since then opposition leader Keir Starmer announced that a Labour government would give businesses the flexibility they need to train their workforce by turning the Conservative Party's apprenticeship levy into a Growth and Skills Levy. After waiting a very long time to hear anything meaningful about the Growth and Skills Levy, we have suddenly been inundated in the opening months of 2026 with a raft of hugely significant and hugely contentious changes in quick succession. So what have been the big changes to apprenticeships since the start of this year? Why has the government decided to take such an active role in the apprenticeship system when its predecessor shied away from this approach? And will these recent changes help tackle the rising concerns about rising unemployment among young people? My guests are Stephen Evans, the Chief Executive at the Learning and Work Institute, and Ben Rowland, the Chief Executive of the Association of Employment and Learning Providers, or AELP. I'm Tom Richmond, and to hear about how and why our apprenticeship system is changing, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
It's certainly been a brisk few months of apprenticeship announcements, so let's start by providing a bit of background, because while any government is perfectly entitled to make decisions about funding and how it's spent, these recent decisions are perhaps more significant than they might first appear when you situate them in a historical context. Ben, why is any government intervention in the apprenticeship system actually quite unusual given the direction of travel over the past decade or so?
The big change, as you say, implicit in the announcements recently has been this shift from the whole setup under the levy, which is that the employer gets to decide. We always had this conversation around, devolution and apprenticeships, and our line was always at ALP was always, well, actually apprenticeships are devolved to employers. It's up to them to decide what programs and who they want to put on those programs. And so the changes that have been announced recently, starting with the defunding of level 7 apprenticeships for everyone apart from those aged 21 or under when they start, which was in effect most people who were doing those programs, was the first time that principle had been overruled. But of course, once you overrule a principle, it's no longer a guiding principle. And so that has been a big change. And we've seen then the defunding of the 16 more standards built around leadership and management, but actually others as well, which again was a sign that government was saying, actually, we get to decide. That is a big shift. The previous government, the whole point of the levy was we don't decide. It's up to employers. And we don't even decide the budget. The budget is this 0.5% of payroll, and that's what employers have to spend. In reality, it was never really applied in a pure sense. So the previous government topped up each employer's apprenticeship account, allowed them to carry on going. So it wasn't pure either. But this change is the government saying, no, we get to decide actually what the right programs are. And now, with the incentives for specific subsets of learners, we get to decide which learners are prioritised as well. So that's been the big shift. As you say, it wasn't announced as such. It was sort of not by stealth, because none of this was secret, but no one drew out the full implications of that. So I think that's an important thing that you started with. I think you're right.
Okay, so this mantra of apprenticeships being employer-led, as I suppose the previous government would have described it, it's certainly not looking as definitive as it was just a few years ago. But the policy changes we're going to discuss today, which have chipped away at this notion of employer-led apprenticeships, are certainly not random. They are all related in one way or another to young people, and this government's desire to push apprenticeships towards young people. So, Stephen, why is the current government so worried about the plight of young people at the moment?
Well, I mean, there's almost 1 million young people not in education, employment or training. That's up about a third since the pandemic and is much higher than other countries like the Netherlands, for example, where far fewer than 1 in 10 young people would be neat. And being out of education and work when you're young can have really long-term damaging impacts on your pay and job prospects. So it's one of those things you want to nip in the bud early for young people's sake, but also for our economy so we can grow a bit more, and for employers so they can get the talent they need, and actually for the taxpayer because we want young people in work and paying their taxes rather than out of work and on benefits. So it's definitely something the government's right to be worried about. And apprenticeships are part of the answer. Apprenticeships for young people have gone down by a third since 2017 when the current apprenticeship levy system was introduced. And they weren't that high to start with. So they've gone from low to very low. And that needs to change if we're going to tackle that need problem.
Okay, so the backdrop is that the previous government largely left employers alone to choose the apprenticeships that suited them. But now we've got rising levels of youth unemployment, which has convinced the current government to start intervening more directly in an attempt to generate more opportunities for young people. So let's look at the first big intervention, which, as Ben said, was the decision from January this year to ban anyone aged 22 and over from starting a level 7 apprenticeship, which is equivalent to a master's degree. Last year, only around 23,000 apprentices started a level 7 course, so they're not huge, but those apprentices tended to be older learners. Almost 2/3 of them were aged over 25, and level 7 apprentices tend to come from less deprived backgrounds than other apprentices too. Just 2 courses account for 70% of all level 7 apprenticeships. A senior leader course for training those with senior management responsibility, and an accountancy and taxation professional course for those providing financial information and advice. Because level 7 apprenticeships are typically very expensive, the government has estimated that they could save £200 million a year by banning anyone aged 22 and over from starting these courses. Stephen, I suppose there are 2 issues at play here. If the government wants to save money, were they right to pick on level 7 apprenticeships? And if they were, was the decision to restrict them to those aged 21 and under the best option that they had available? So what's your take on all this?
So you're right, that the government wants to try and pivot the apprenticeship system more towards young people. I think the other 2 things that are going on here is that there's a limited pot of money, lots of calls on the public finances. Taxes are already quite a high proportion of GDP historically. So you've got a fixed pot. If you want to increase one thing, you've got to decrease another. And then the government wants to be more active in its industrial strategy and try and promote growth. And it thinks directing the system a bit more will help that. So you've got all of those things going on. Now, if you ask most people what they think an apprentice looks like, they're going to describe a young person starting out, not a manager in their 40s. So to an extent, part of this is getting back to what most people would think an apprenticeship actually is. Now, for me, the government's right to make this change, given the fiscal context. It'd be great to do everything, but we can't. Leadership and management is really important. It is one of the things that holds back productivity, but that doesn't mean that an apprenticeship is the answer to that problem always and in all cases. There are other ways to improve leadership and management. And of course, if these sorts of apprenticeships are really brilliant for employers, really boosting their business, they're just absolutely fantastic, then the good news is employers can pay for that training outside of the levy themselves. The levy was always meant to be a minimum spend on apprenticeships, not a maximum spend on training. Of course, that's easy to say in the current economy and much more difficult to do. But we do need to think about, even if leadership and management is important, which it is, what's the best way to fix it? Not always an apprenticeship. And how do we fund it in a world where we've got a limited pot of public funding? Employers don't see it as public funding, but funding in the apprenticeship system that the government's deciding the rules about. What else can we do to fund this outside of that?
So what do you make of this decision to go for an age 21 as the cutoff? Does that make sense in your view for a level 7 apprenticeship?
Well, this wasn't the original policy announcement, was it? It was going to be all age groups. And then I think there was various bits of lobbying that went on from various parties and sectors. I think the NHS may have even found some extra money to pay for some of these things themselves, is my understanding too. The argument is we want to pivot the system to young people. If you're under 21, you're a young person. Actually, this is going to cut out most of the numbers, so you will make the saving. I would make the point that you made earlier, though, Tom, which is that a lot of these higher apprenticeships, which is level 6 as well as level 7 in the jargon, they could be a brilliant route for social mobility and widening access to participation in higher education, but they're not at the moment. We have the same inequalities in access to them as we do for higher education more broadly. So I would say that age cutoff could make sense if we make more efforts than we have done to widen participation so they're truly a route to social mobility.
Ben, you've been very critical of the government's decision to restrict level 7 apprenticeships in some of your public commentary. So are you persuaded that this was the least bad option, or do you just think it was just a bad option regardless?
I have some sympathy for some of the changes for the reasons that Stephen talks about. Some level 7 apprenticeships, if you look at who was on them, the organisations using them, you would find it quite difficult for a lay member of the public to say, yes, that's what I have in mind as an apprentice. But not all level 7 apprenticeships were leadership and management, and not all leadership and management apprenticeships are level 7. There were a number which, particularly, for example, in, say, accountancy or law, which allowed people to go to full professional qualification without having to go through the expensive and socially exclusive path of having to take on debt to go to university. And those programs in particular were used by organisations who either hadn't had a good track record of social mobility, and so it was a key tool for them to open up, or were in parts of the country where, so high street solicitors, high street accountants in all parts of the country, where they were able to offer genuinely aspirational pathways for local young people, the kind of thing that the government wants to see. And actually they were cutting it off. There are also some very specific professions where we have shortages. I mean, one of the things now in the planning system, which was a big part of the government's growth plan, we don't have enough town planners. Well, town planning was a level 7 apprenticeship. It only had 300 people on it a year, but that was a really tried and trusted pathway to resolve this major bottleneck on our whole economic growth. So the implementation of it was very crude, and it was crude in terms of which programs, how they selected for the programs. It was crude on the age cutoff, because actually I'm not unsympathetic to an age cutoff, but there are many, many people who age 22, 23, 24 are still trying to find their way in the world, don't know quite what it's for. So to have that opportunity taken away from them felt very crude. And then back to Stephen, Stephen makes this really interesting point about when they're a great success, is that not a sign that government should stop funding them? And it kind of is and it isn't. It brings to mind a timing issue, which is actually this takes 5-10 years or more, maybe a generation, where you establish that the tried and tested pathway to get talent into your organisation is through this route. And then you can look at the funding and say, actually, we're now going to withdraw funding, and you signal it very clearly. The way they implemented it was pretty much as bad as it could be, which is to say there's going to be a definite cut-off. Between now and then, you can fill your boots and get as many starts as you possibly can, which meant that it's going to be many years before that £200 million savings comes through, because everyone has tucked in and got themselves on, secured lots of 2-year programs. So a bunch of stuff in that I think they got wrong. And I think that if they'd stopped and thought, they could have made much smarter changes and brought people with them.
Let's jump forward from January to March, when we had another significant intervention, because the government announced the end of funding for 16 apprenticeships, as Ben mentioned at the start. These included popular leadership and management courses such as Team Leader and Operations Manager, which both attracted around 13,000 trainees last year. And meanwhile, the Chartered Manager Degree Apprenticeship attracted around 3,000 trainees and came with a price tag of £22,000 per learner. Ministers said that they are, quote, focusing funding where it's needed most, because, again, many of the people on these courses were older learners who are typically already in work, as opposed to younger or unemployed learners. The government expects to save around £300 million by removing these 16 apprenticeships. Ben, you told FE Week in March that, quote, the government is dismantling the current system with the defunding of a number of cherished employer-led programmes such as Team Leader and Management Apprenticeships, but has not yet shown what their vision for the replacement system is. So, in your view, what's the bigger problem here? The decision to close down these courses against the wishes of some employers and training providers, or just the absence of a vision for what comes next?
I think it's the two together. I think that leadership and management is recognised as a serious skills shortage, and that to that extent it justifies government spend. Now, You might not have designed apprenticeships as the method for addressing that, but you need something. And apprenticeship units, these are parts of the new system that's been announced, looked for a moment as though they would be the way of replacing full apprenticeships with much shorter versions of apprenticeships. That would have suggested a vision which said, yes, we need to do something on leadership management, but just not through apprenticeships. So I think that to defund something that is recognised as being really important and which a load of employers really bought into and cherished and valued without a full explanation and without a replacement, but just with the rather sort of high-end, sort of slightly vacuous statements about, yes, we know leadership and management's important, but we haven't got anything for them, just didn't feel very convincing to us.
Stephen, how supportive are you of the decision to cut funding for these 16 apprenticeships, some of which have undoubtedly become very popular over the past few years?
Yes, well, I agree with Ben that it would be better to have some form of alternative plan to say leadership and management is important. This is how we're going to deal with it. And I think one of the reasons I would contend we've perhaps ended up in this position is because I think the government was worried about the apprenticeship budgets overspending if we carried on as is. And therefore, some of these demand control cost saving measures are just to keep us within the envelope rather than to increase lots of spending elsewhere. And I think that's one of the challenges that we've got. I would just sort of slightly push back a little bit on one thing that Ben was hinting at there, which is leadership and management is very important. Therefore, government intervention and spending is justified on it, because I don't think one necessarily follows the other. Firms are the ones who are going to benefit from better leadership and management. They should be more productive, make more money for their shareholders and all the rest of it. So we have had government funded leadership and management programs before. They were relatively small, to be fair. And if you look at the leadership and management apprenticeships, I think a fairly high proportion were in larger firms rather than smaller firms, which is where you sometimes get less qualified managers or some of those issues that we talked about before. So I'm not sure we were hitting the right buttons, or that government spending is always the way to answer the problem that we've got here. I think this was the right move, but I agree with Ben that you also needed a plan to say, this stuff's very important and here's our alternative approach, and we haven't got that.
So it doesn't sound like either of you are massively keen on the idea of funding be withdrawn, but without much of a plan in place to address any potential deficiencies. But some potentially good news has also been emerging alongside these rather drastic cuts. Starting this April, the government has launched apprenticeship units, as Ben was just describing a moment ago, which are essentially components of existing apprenticeships that are now available as standalone short courses. 10 units have been announced so far, covering areas such as welding, installing solar panels, and AI leadership training. This concept of shorter courses alongside full apprenticeships seems to me to have been warmly welcomed in general, as it could offer more flexibility to employers. But there has been plenty of disquiet around some aspects of the units, not least the roughly £25 an hour funding rates, which have been variously described as unviable and wholly misaligned with reality. Ben, I can imagine that across your membership, you've probably had a very broad range of views about apprenticeship units. So what do you make of the government's plans so far? Are there more positives or negatives at this point?
I think it is finely balanced. I think the viability is a lot to do with when you design these programs and you put the rules around them and the funding around them. These are at the draconian end. So they're tight, very tight on money, but not impossible, but very tight. But then you add to that the payment terms for providers is very tough, as in most of it is at the end of the program. And the requirement is that people, I mean, as you would hope, they have to attend the program, but a lot of that is in the employers and the employees' control, not the provider's control. So as a provider, you look at it and go, well, we're only just about going to cover our costs if we get big enough cohorts coming together. But then we only get paid that if the employers and the employees all, play ball and turn up to all the classes that they're supposed to, the sessions that they're supposed to. So it's really tight from that point of view. But I think from a content point of view, there's one or two questions around whether it really does cover everything. There are definitely questions in some industries about whether you get some sort of accreditation, if not a qualification, an accreditation that shows that you really are industry capable. And the things where you're dealing with electricity, for example, people really want to know that you haven't just been on a program, but that you really know how to install the kit that is needing to be installed. So that is another big question. I think we're going to have to wait and see how the government said this is test and learn. Let's see if it is trial and error rather than, as someone else said, error then trial. We hope that they look at it and see how it does plan out and say, actually, do you know what, we can adjust this. I do think there's a fundamental question which comes back to the budget issue that Stephen was talking about, which is, on the one hand, we know the minister wants these to fire out of the cannon and be really successful and popular. On the other hand, they don't want it to fire out of the cannon because they're going to need more gunpowder, and they don't have enough gunpowder to do it. So they need to find a mechanism in their own minds about how you set and distribute funding caps for the total programme.
Stephen, I know you've written in the past about how more flexibility could be beneficial within the apprenticeship system as far as employers are concerned. So should I assume that you're quite positive then about the idea of apprenticeship units alongside full apprenticeships?
Yeah, I think we've argued for a long time for more flexibility, for shorter courses, for modules of things, because apprenticeships are great, but they're not the answer to all problems. And there was a time when it was slightly heretical to say that. So I'm glad we've kind of moved on a little bit. I do think, to add to what Ben said, that there's a little bit of pre-election rhetoric colliding with reality here as well, because there's a pretty small number of units that are not going to be applicable to most employers here. So we might be testing and learning, but we're not doing much testing really. And before the general election, Labour said employers will be able to spend up to 50% of their levy payments, if they're a large employer paying the levy, on things that weren't apprenticeships. And this is going to be pretty diddly. And of course, employers are then going to be a bit upset because not only can they not do some of the apprenticeships they wanted to do, but now they can't do some of this flex they wanted to do. And they feel like it's their money. So I think the challenge is the sort of scale. And on the incentives point, the payment structure that Ben was talking about, as an ex-government official, I can completely see the argument. You don't want to pay this money up front to providers and then maybe not even get these very, very short courses finished. So you think, oh, we'll put most of it at the end. But then if you actually went out and spoke to providers, employers, you probably find out this felt like quite a low funding rate per hour. And it's a relatively small amount of money overall. And it's going to be small numbers. And therefore, if you're only getting it at the end and you're not in control of everything, is it worth me bothering with? So I think this is a little bit about the overall budget position, but it's also about how government designs policy. And it would be much better for them to do it more collaboratively. That's an easy thing for me to say now. I'm not working in government, but I think you would just get to a more sensible place if you did that.
You mentioned this point around collaboration. It's also links to something that you were talking about earlier, Stephen, which is the industrial strategy, because these 10 units, which are very small in number, obviously, they've been deliberately chosen because they are relevant to the government's industrial strategy, which is being used to prioritise some sectors over other sectors in an effort to boost economic growth. We've also seen this with foundation apprenticeships, which are new entry-level paid jobs with a structured training programme alongside them. They've been created specifically in sectors such as health and social care, construction and engineering, which are also priorities in the industrial strategy, although, to be fair, new foundation apprenticeships have been added in retail and hospitality recently. So, Stephen, what we're seeing across various announcements is a very clear theme around pushing more funding and resources towards apprenticeships in very specific parts of the economy, not releasing it to all employers, but the government picking winners in effect. Is it sensible to try and direct and use apprenticeship funding in this way?
Well, I think the first point I make is the one thing foundation apprenticeships or not are apprenticeships. An apprenticeship is a job with substantial training. In most leading apprenticeship countries, they last sort of, 3 years, two years would be a bit short. So I hereby try and enlist your listeners in my campaign to stop calling everything an apprenticeship, even where it's not. I shall now get off my hobby horse and answer your question. I think this goes back a little bit to the philosophy of the government, which is a more activist approach, and intervening and focusing on particular sectors is more likely to get growth going. And growth has just been rubbish, hasn't it, since the financial crisis? And then secondly, if you've got a fixed amount of money, you've got to decide where to put it. That's where this is coming from. I think for me, the challenge comes a little bit in, firstly, we've now got the industrial strategy sectors +2. So we've already added a couple on because we've decided things like health and construction are quite important. So you always end up with people saying, well, what about the foundation economy? Because most people work in health, social care, retail and hospitality, and productivity there is lower than in comparable countries. Treasury says, well, these 8 sectors will get the economy going. And then secondly, within those sectors, the government's coming up or getting those sectors to come up with jobs plans, and that includes the role of apprenticeships and other things in there. The risk is this is a lobbyist's dream, and he who shouts loudest will get the most. And is the money going to go on the stuff that will have the greatest impact or on the interest group that shouts loudest? So this is my worry with some of these kind of planning type mechanisms. But in principle, I think if you've got a fixed amount of money, you've got to decide where to put it. Growth has been terrible for 15 years. So put more of it where some growth will start. And then if growth does start, then hopefully that raises money for everything else. This is not about principle. Whether you can do it in practice is my concern.
Ben, are you encouraged by the desire to link apprenticeship units and foundation apprenticeships to particular industry sectors, or is this just the wrong approach in your view? I guess your membership must cover all the sectors, both those which have been lucky enough to be included in the list, but also those which have missed out. Is this the right way to approach apprenticeship policy?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that having an industrial strategy is a good thing. What I haven't seen in the industrial strategy is what for me is part of every strategy is, well, what have we got? What tools have we got at our disposal? And actually, while skills may be one of the tools you've got, more skills in our industrial strategy areas will help them. I think the skills economy operates in a different way from, say, outright subsidy or, planning permission rules being bent towards a particular industry and so on. So in skills, the analogy that I sometimes use is of someone sitting in the corner of a big cold sitting room and saying, well, I only want to warm up the corner I'm sitting in. Well, you can't. You have to warm up the whole room to warm up your corner of the room. You might be able to start there. And that's how skills work. I mean, skills, if you want someone to be your new level 4 advanced manufacturing apprentice, they're probably going to come from a level 3 normal manufacturing background. The way in which people move through the economy is through the whole economy. And you need to warm the whole room. And I don't think government really understands those connections. And also those connections, it's all well and good having a wonderful new life science park. But if the fact that the roads are so full of potholes that the specimens jars get smashed every time they're going to and from the lab, it doesn't matter. You need good logistics. You need good highways engineers. You need good people working in the creche so that people can go to work and be confident that they can concentrate on their new industry. All of those things genuinely connect. And then, of course, you've got the other effects of if everyone is employed well and earning a bit better than they were before, that lifts everyone up. I'm all for industrial strategy, but targeting skills as a method, as a main method for driving up your industrial strategy, I don't think works.
Okay, we are approaching the end of this episode, so it's time for my final question. On the one hand, this string of recent announcements has left some employers and training providers feeling rather aggrieved as the government now takes an active role in determining who gets access to the limited available funding. On the other hand, we have a government that is willing to make decisions and name its priorities, so ministers are clearly not shy about steering the apprenticeship system in a new direction if they believe it will help them achieve their goals. So my question is, what is the next change that the government should now make to improve the apprenticeship system in England, either in relation to the decisions we've already discussed today, or perhaps something else entirely? Ben, what would be your choice for the next change in our apprenticeship system?
The next change I would urge the government to put in place is to tilt or pivot their word of choice from incentives aimed at employers to incentives aimed at providers. Now, that is not just a selfish message on behalf of my members. It is based on an analysis of what will actually move the dial. And in talking to employers and indeed being an employer and experiencing this myself, the offer of £3,000 or £5,000 to take on a young person is not enough. And actually what we've got at the moment is a risk of many tens of thousands of incentives at that scale being fragmented across many different employers, none of which then moves the dial. Whereas actually, if you said to a provider, here's £1,500 to get this kind of person into this kind of apprenticeship, actually they can look at that and say, well, if I do 100 of those, then that's £150,000. Now that does move the dial. So actually, if the government wants to move the dial, then incentives to providers to cover the extra costs of servicing SME apprenticeships or younger people apprenticeships. It's not just purely incentive. It is actually covering real extra costs. I think would make a bigger difference than incentives aimed at employers.
Thank you, Ben. Stephen, what do you think the next big change needs to be in our apprenticeship system?
Well, I would be wanting to broaden and deepen the content of apprenticeships and their quality, where I fear we've taken a bit of a step backwards in the last 2 years, actually. So part of my next step would be reversing some of the things that happened in the last year or so. So, for example, if you went to Germany and you said to someone there, we've decided a year is far too long for apprenticeships, we can do them in 9 months in some cases, and people don't need to learn English and maths as part of it if they haven't got that level of skill. And we've decided to have much narrower ones that prepare you for your current job and not for a broader career. They would assume they'd misheard. But that's kind of where we've got to. So I would want more core skills like English, maths and digital, but funded properly and properly contextualised to the jobs that they're engaging. And I would want broader apprenticeship standards and fewer of them so that they prepare you for your wider career, not just your current job. And I think that would help employers and it would help individuals who are doing apprenticeships be difficult to do, and it might affect the numbers. And this is why it's always a bit easier to say when you're not in government, but that quality is every bit as important as the quantity at different age groups. So I'd really be focusing on that quality, broadening and deepening the content of apprenticeships.
Thank you, Stephen. And that brings us to the end of this episode. My thanks to Stephen and Ben for giving us their perspective on what has been a very busy few months in the world of apprenticeships. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with others and leave a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.